Now, when you see inflation hitting 9%, you go, boy, my 100 grand lost $9,000 in purchasing power in the last 12 months. I am seriously, safely losing money. We're going to be sharing with you an article from Jesse Kramer's blog, Best Interest Blog, and it is titled, Should You Invest Your Emergency Fund?
Question mark, right? He's got a big question mark there. Jesse Kramer, great blog. It looks like he's got a little bit of a disagreement with somebody here, and he's going to turn it. I love it. I love it when you take timely things that happen in your life and turn them into an article that can serve, right? This is an article that can serve. We talk a lot about liquidity. We talk a lot about emergency funds. We talk about different definitions. You know, some people call them slush funds. Some people call them kitties. Got any acronyms for emergency funds?
No,
Oppo funds?
I can just say this. If you wrote something or made a Twitter post or a short video that you posted somewhere and I didn't like what you were doing, and I turned around and wrote a blog, I don't think that I could no longer consider us having a real friendly relationship. I'm surprised that these two are friends after this, especially that this article takes a lot of what was said a little out of context. But for me, when I looked at it, I go, yeah, man, this is something that we come across all the time.
Day in,
Folks
day out.
are looking at investing their emergency fund, or they've already invested their emergency fund, or they don't know how much to keep in their emergency fund. I mean, there's a lot that people tend to get misconstrued, and it can be due to some of the misinformation that's out there on the internet today, or the random tweets that we come across when people are talking about that kitty.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, you think about the last couple of years and how low interest rates have been and how little interest, you know, the traditional banking, savings, high interest savings accounts have really been paying. And you can understand why some folks have become excited about trying to find new avenues for this emergency fund, because they haven't been rewarded. It's been that war on savers.
Well,
right?
It wasn't that big a deal when inflation was 1%, 2%, 3%, right? Say, well, you look at it and go, boy, I didn't make anything on my 100 grand over the last 12 months, but inflation was 2%, so I lost $2,000. Yeah, and you probably didn't even think about it at the time. Now, when you see inflation hitting 9%, you go, boy, my 100 grand lost $9,000 in purchasing power in the last 12 months. I am seriously, safely losing money. I'm losing a lot. That's close to $800 a month that I'm losing on this $100,000. And you could easily do that math. If it's $200,000, $1 million, if you have a lot of cash, it is costing you to hold that much cash. So you start looking at what else should I do with those dollars. And I think there's been some arguments for investing that emergency fund that do make sense and have evolved a little bit over the years. And one of those things that hasn't really evolved, I mean, returns, right?
Yeah.
We have the opportunity to invest our emergency fund and earn a higher rate of return to help us at least get close to keeping up with inflation, if not outpacing inflation. So returns is the obvious one. The next one that maybe you didn't consider is liquidity.
Yeah, liquidity is, you know, how quickly can you put your hands on the money? If it's in the bank, you just go over to the bank and write a check, or you ask for a deposit. Although that's a little more challenging if it's a large dollar amount, but still understanding how quickly you can safely put that money in your hand is my definition of liquidity.
Yeah, it didn't used to be quite as liquid to throw money in the S&P 500 ETF. You go, well, if I throw it in SPY, I can get it back in 48, 72 hours. It's just...
Yeah, 20 years ago, you were throwing it in a front-end loaded mutual fund that would take, you know, weeks to liquidate, plus you were paying a commission on the deposit.
So there's a lot more liquidity when you're taking risk and investing today.
It's a lot easier.
Opportunity to keep up with inflation or outpace inflation. So we have returns and liquidity, great reasons to invest your emergency fund. You know, quite often there can be, you ever take one of those T-charts and you put all the reasons for doing something on one side and all the reasons for not doing something on the other side. And whenever I looked at that, I'd go, yeah, so I've got more reasons on one side than the other, but it really only takes one really, really bad reason to overcome all the good reasons why I should do something.
Yeah, it's not a one-to-one.
No, it's not. You have to apply a weighting to these different factors, and that big factor here is risk. If you'd like to take the information that you've gleaned here to the next level, all you have to do is this. Click the link in the description and schedule a 15-minute phone consultation with an advisor on our team where you can get answers to your own unique questions and concerns.
Yeah, what's the point of an emergency fund? Typically, it's to be there in the event that there is a real challenge in your life. You lose a job, lose a loved one, have an emergency expense. It's there to provide you comfort to know when all heck is breaking loose, you have some support.
Yeah, and so at this point in the article, Jesse kind of takes a little segue into a tweet from his best friend Brennan, I guess. And when he takes a look at this tweet, he actually offers a quote from the video that was posted on Twitter, which I watched. And the quote here, the article says, "I invest my emergency fund in a total stock index fund because even if it dropped by 50%, I'd be okay. I'd still have enough money for emergencies." That's not exactly what was said. Now, granted, this person does invest their emergency fund, right? So they invest pretty much all their emergency fund. However, he actually said, I'd be okay up to 70% loss in the stock market, and I would still have plenty of funds available for emergencies. And the reality of this is this couple, so Brennan is a CPA, financial personality, and he says they had a big debt issue, they paid off all their debt, they paid off their home mortgage, and they set aside $40,000 in an emergency fund, which covered 12 months of their expenses. So not huge spenders, right? They put $40,000 in an emergency fund, 12 months of their expenses. Then they go, that's a little too much. They invested $20K of it. Now they have $20,000 in an emergency fund that covers 6 months of expenses. Then they said, that seems like too much. And they knocked it down from $20,000 to $10,000. Still, at $10,000, that's 3 months of their expenses. So that's a pretty reasonable emergency fund. That's 3 to 6 months of your expenses is exactly what this article talks about, right?
Especially if there's 2 incomes in the house, right? Dave Ramsey would be like three months is good.
Yeah, you have $1,000 to cover insurance deductibles, then 3 to 6 months of spending in case you lose your job. That's kind of the framework that's even broken down in this article. But then Brennan takes it to another level. He goes, then we took it down to $5,000. Then we took it down to $3,000. So they took it down to about 1 month of their expenses set aside in emergency fund. Now, what makes Brennan pretty unique is, one, they've got a paid off mortgage, and this guy's probably in his 40s by the look of him. Young couple, paid off mortgage, and they have 2 incomes. They are a household that earns 2 incomes, and they don't have any children.
I was going to say they're dinks.
There's
double income, no kids.
Yeah, double income,
dinks.
No kids.
Dinkers.
Exactly. So a lot of emergencies come up with your kids, right? They don't have that to worry about.
Most of mine do.
And they only live off of one of their salaries. So one of the 2 of them could lose their job, and that would be an unlikely event.
Still be enough.
And it would still be okay, especially because one of them owns their own business here, and they have $10,000 in an HSA that they could access that is in cash, okay? And $10,000 alone, there's an extra $10K that makes up about 3 months worth of their expenses, and they pay quarterly taxes. They already have all of their quarterly taxes set aside in reserves in their business accounts. That's taken care of. And they have multiple lines. He says we have multiple lines of defense, and it would take a global disaster.
A fortress.
He's got a fortress, right? Yeah. And that's why he goes on to say, this is not appropriate for the vast majority of people.
Brennan said that in his video. But
yes.
That didn't get brought up.
That didn't get brought up here.
Article.
So I just wanted to get some prompts to Brennan here.
You were fighting for Brennan here today.
I think there's some things that could be taken out of context when you look at just a one-liner like this. That you could look at that video or the quick tweet and say, oh, Brennan invests all of his emergency fund. Then you got to go watch the 5-minute video to really understand that that's not really the case. Even some of the replies in the tweet after that were complete. They obviously did not watch the video, right? So people were already taking what they saw in 10 words, and they were going out and they were exercising on this. They were actually implementing on this. They were moving money into the stock market that used to be their emergency fund. And this is, there's the risk.
Yeah.
Right?
Two things that I really like about the story, Brennan's story, is one, they took some action, right? They saw an issue in their personal personal finance, right? Their personal situation and said, hey, I feel like we got too much here. What do you think? Okay, they made a decision. We're going to move 20 over. Then 6 months later, however long it was, they decided they were taking action, number one. Two, they were having meaningful conversations about money as a household. That's great. That's healthy. But also, Jesse makes the point that their emergency fund was 30 grand, but if he was comfortable losing 50% of it, then his real number is 15,000. So finding your number.
Set aside 15,000 and invest the other 15.
Yeah,
Don't put the whole 30 in the stock
So
market.
the exercise that Brendan went through with his wife, figuring out what your number, I think, is the biggest takeaway here. What do you have to have? What does your spouse have to have in the bank at all times? Safe, liquid, emergency fund, no matter what's going on in the market to sleep well at night.
And I think the next piece of that is Brennan's, not Jesse's, but Brennan's comment about we have multiple lines of defense. So, and I think that's what we often see is overlooked as folks come in and visit with our team. They think they have a $50,000 emergency fund. And then we find there's $50,000 in cash in a brokerage account. There's $100,000 in cash value life insurance. Yeah. There's excess reserves in the business that they own of $500,000. They've got a home equity line of credit.
Well,
on
you
the
talked
sides.
about the HSA. I'm looking at this going, why isn't the HSA invested, right? They've got dual income. They shouldn't be paying medical expenses out of that HSA. Like, keep maxing out that HSA. Keep all your receipts. Keep all your receipts for all the expenses that you've come across medically since you opened that HSA. And then now that HSA could be an emergency fund too. But to the same point, getting that invested might be a great thing when they're 65.
Triple tax-free, right? You get a tax
Super
deduction,
off.
it grows tax-free, it comes out tax-free. That's the one you want invested aggressively more than anything else is that HSA, arguably anyways. But, for me, I think that was one of the things, just taking a look at all the different places that you have dollars that are emergency funds. You might find that you have much more than you actually need set aside in an emergency fund. The last takeaway that I want to make sure gets emphasized here is so Brennan, Jesse says in this article, Brennan should not put the first $15,000 at any risk. This is what you mentioned earlier. He says it's earmarked for emergencies. If it went down, he'd feel stressed. That's what I wanted to lay into. He'd feel stressed. And that tells me there's really not just one purpose for emergency fund. Your emergency fund solves for two different things. It's for safety and security. Safety, financial safety, knowing that you could go get those dollars if you had an emergency. It's there to solve for the furnace breaking down, the car breaking down, the roof needing repairs, the kids that need help, whatever it is. It's there for safety purposes, but then it's also there for security. And I see that as a psychological benefit of having that emergency fund. There are massive psychological benefits to having a security, an emergency fund. And there's been a lot of research that's been done around this, showing that the relative balance that you have, not your net worth, not the size of your brokerage account, but the relative size of your emergency fund, the safe cash that you can access in the moment of an emergency relative to your overall net worth. That is one of the biggest predictors, a bigger predictor than your net worth in how financially confident you are.
Financial peace of mind, right? Generally, that comes from, in when you touched on that, return is not what that account's designed for, right? You're trying to seek return in other places. So if you looked at the compounded annual returns over the last 10 years of all of your accounts, that fractional impact that small account made to reduce your overall total return was meaningless compared to the sizable growth you got in other areas of the plan.
And that really wraps it all up with investing with purpose. What is the purpose for the dollars? Isolate that purpose and invest with that intent.